Imagine this for a hell of a scene. A coffin on stage and a voodoo chant ringing through the dark. A man howling like a demon, clutching a skull named Henry as fireworks spark around him. The song erupts and the crowd go wild like in some orgiastic voodoo ritual. Offstage, the same man boasts of fighting in wars and fathering a literally staggering number of children across the globe. It's Screamin Jay Hawkins, of course. He lived life like a Phineas Fogg who got into bed with the devil himself. He marries 6 times, gets stabbed by a jealous lover, and spends years in exile only to be rediscovered living in a trailer and ready for a blistering comeback. This is the bizarre, exhilarating, and often tragic saga of Jealousy Screamin Jay Hawkins, a life where the line between fact and myth is always blurred and always under a dark and dangerous spell. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Jealousy Jay Hawkins was born on July the 18th, 1929, in Cleveland, Ohio. By Hawkins' own account, he entered the world under strange and inauspicious circumstances. He was, so he said, one of several siblings from different fathers who was given up by his mother and raised by a kindly tribe of Blackfoot Native Americans. The truth, however, was rather less exotic. Hawkins was indeed the product of a difficult childhood, though. His mother, Marie, already had more children than she could feed and placed baby Jealousy in foster care shortly after his birth. He was taken in by a woman named Edith Randolph, whom Hawkins later embellished into a wealthy Blackfoot Indian benefactor in his tall tales. But then, reality never satisfied Jay Hawkins, certainly not when a more colourful story would do. As a boy in Cleveland, young Jealousy found himself in music. He later claimed he had been a prodigy, teaching himself piano as a toddler and reading sheet music fluently by age 6, though such boasts were likely part of his lifelong myth-making. What is certain is that he showed an early aptitude and passion for sound. He idolised dramatic vocalists like Paul Robeson and even dreamed of becoming an opera singer. Hawkins did receive some classical piano training as a child, but by his own recollection, he didn't really care for formal lessons. In one interview, he described telling his tutor to leave him be because he wasn't going to do things, quote, the old conventional way. He had his own ideas, and if the teacher stuck around, I'm going to make your life miserable, he threatened. It was an early sign of the rule-breaking wild spirit that would later both fuel his fame and blow up his troubles into a firestorm. In 1942, at just 13 years old, Jealousy Hawkins decided he'd had enough of school and childhood. World War II was raging, and the teenager was ready for adventure and glory. So, Hawkins forged his birth certificate, lied about his age, and enlisted in the US Army. He would brag in later years that he had fought bravely in the Pacific Theater, even claiming he was captured by Japanese forces and survived months of torture in a POW camp before enacting a one-man massacre during his escape, Rambo style. I was a young dude, but I did a lot of killing. I enjoyed it, Hawkins told a documentary filmmaker decades later, adding a quite chilling line saying, "It was beautiful to me to be able to take a life knowing I don't have to go to jail." These gruesome tales were delivered with a showman's panache, and Hawkins repeated them often. But official records tell a different story. The truth is that Hawkins enlisted in December 1945, 3 months after World War II had already ended, and never saw combat. He served honourably, yes, but as part of the Special Services Entertainment Unit, playing music for the troops rather than fighting on the front lines. The closest he came to battle was likely punching notes a bit too hard on a piano. Hawkins' military stint did ignite another of his passions. Boxing. Stationed far from actual war, he spent his late teens in the Army's boxing program, honing his physique. With his long, powerful limbs and fearless attitude, Hawkins was a natural in the ring. After leaving the service in 1952, he continued to duke it out in amateur bouts and local Golden Gloves competitions around Cleveland. In later years, he would embellish this chapter too, claiming he won the middleweight boxing championship of Alaska in 1949 and other titles. But just like his war stories, these boxing laurels turned out to be more fiction than fact. No records exist of a Jealousy Hawkins winning any major tournament in those days. The real middleweight Golden Gloves champion of 1947, for instance, was a fighter named Nick Ranieri, not Hawkins. And the boxer Hawkins said he beat for the Alaska title had actually retired years before Hawkins ever set foot in the territory. After his discharge from the army in 1952, Hawkins returned to Cleveland as a young man hungry to make his mark. He had music in his veins, an outsized personality, and a chip on his shoulder. He also had a family to support. During his army years, Hawkins had married a woman named Elsie Anna Mae Williams, and together they had started a family, including a daughter, Suki. For a while, Hawkins tried to balance domestic life with his musical ambitions. He would later recount how he even brought Anna Mae and baby Suki out on the road with him in his early career. But home and hearth were never going to contain the force of nature that was Screamin Jay. He soon abandoned his young family, one day telling his wife he was heading to the store and simply never coming back. It was a cruel foreshadowing of how he'd treat many loved ones to come, and it left the wounds that would never fully heal. His daughter Suki later said, "My father thought he was all that, but not to me. He didn't treat people right." Footloose and free, Jealousy Hawkins threw himself into the black music clubs and revues that thrived in mid-century America. He cut an imposing figure at the piano, belting out blues and jazz with a voice that could swing low and sweet one moment and erupt in a feral roar the next. By 1951, he had begun performing in places like Cleveland's Gleason's Musical Bar and the Rose Room Lounge, making a name for himself on the local circuit. His big break came when he crossed paths with two key figures, famous DJ Alan Freed and band leader Tiny Grimes. Alan Freed, the Cleveland disc jockey, who would actually coin the term rock and roll in the public consciousness, was an important ally. Hawkins had listened to Freed's radio show and was amazed by the DJ's deep passion for rhythm and blues. Hawkins actually assumed from Freed's voice that the DJ must be black. Upon meeting him, Hawkins was astonished to discover Freed was white, yet deeply in love with black music. The two struck up a friendship built on that mutual love of music. Freed encouraged the young entertainer and would later play an instrumental role in catapulting Hawkins to fame. The other pivotal encounter was with guitarist Tiny Grimes, a jazz and R&B player known for performing in a kilt and tam o' shanter as part of Tiny Grimes and his Rockin' Highlanders. Grimes met Hawkins around 1952 and took a liking to the brash young pianist who wasn't afraid to push boundaries. He hired Hawkins as a piano player, vocalist, and even as his personal chauffeur. This was now a traveling apprenticeship that exposed Jay to the wider world of show business. Under Grimes' tutelage, Hawkins sorted his craft and began developing the marvelously uninhibited on-stage style that would soon become his trademark. One night in 1952, at a club in West Virginia, while performing with Grimes' band, Hawkins' raw energy earned him a new nickname. He was delivering the blues with over-the-top fervor. He was singing, shouting, practically preaching, when a jolted fan in the crowd yelled out, "Scream, baby, scream!" Jealousy Hawkins did just that, taking the cue to push his voice even harder. The audience went wild for it. In that electrifying moment, Screamin Jay Hawkins was born, baptized by the roars of the crowd. From then on, Hawkins took on the nickname, and it suited him perfectly. He had found his identity as a larger-than-life blues shouter, unafraid to wail at the moon. Now Christmas is almost on the horizon again, and, if you're like me, getting the present shopping done early is something I aspire to and fail at every year. However, I'm going to make it easy for you by recommending you check out the Rock and Roll Mysteries store, where you can get one of these marvelous shirts for the rock music fans in your life this year. They come in a range of sizes up to 5XL, a variety of colours in high-quality cotton and shipped from the US, EU, UK, Canada and Australia. I designed them myself and they start from $25 or about 20 quid. Every sale massively helps out with the costs of running the channel, so I'm very grateful to every one of you who have bought one already, really I am. Follow the link on screen or down in the description and see if one takes your fancy. Hawkins' first recordings also came courtesy of Tiny Grimes. In 1953, he cut a single called Why Did You Waste My Time?, a smouldering blues number that showcased his powerful baritone voice. Backed by Grimes and the Rockin' Highlanders, the song didn't make the charts, but it gave Hawkins a taste of life as a recording artist and set the stage for bigger things. However, it wasn't long before Hawkins' refusal to be tamed led to a split from Grimes' group. In 1954, during a recording session for a song Hawkins wrote called Screamin Blues, a legendary showdown took place. The producer overseeing the session was Ertegun, the greatly esteemed co-founder of Atlantic Records. Ertegun suggested that Hawkins dial back his frenzied singing a notch. I mean, the song was literally titled Screamin Blues, but Ertegun thought a smoother Fats Domino style might suit it better. That polite advice was the wrong trigger for Jay. Why don't you go and get Fats Domino then? Hawkins snapped. As the exchange grew heated, Ertegun told the volatile singer to calm down. Hawkins saw red. Go to hell, he bellowed at the producer, even cocking back a fist as if ready to slug the smaller man. The session ended in chaos. Screamin Blues was never recorded, and Hawkins soon parted ways with Tiny Grimes' band amid the bad blood. Next, Hawkins found himself in New York working with, of all people, Fats Domino. The pairing of the mellow, rotund New Orleans crooner with the wild Cleveland screamer was, unfortunately, destined to fail. Musically, they were oil and water. Hawkins tried to fit in with Domino's band in 1954, but he couldn't resist turning every song into a raucous spectacle. The breaking point reportedly came when Hawkins showed up to a Domino gig wearing a loud leopard skin suit, looking like some sort of comic book witch doctor amid Fats Domino's genteel crew. Domino, a consummate professional who favoured a more controlled presentation, promptly fired him after that showy wardrobe choice. Hawkins was simply too flamboyant to play second fiddle for long. He was beginning to realise that his future lay in being a star in his own right, on his own terms. By 1955, Screamin Jay Hawkins was a solo act with a big voice and bigger ambitions. He inked a deal with OK Records, a subsidiary of Columbia, and headed into the studio to record what would become his signature song, I Put a Spell on You. The initial vision for the track was far from the deranged voodoo anthem it would later become. Hawkins originally conceived I Put a Spell on You as a straightforward, soulful ballad about heartache. In fact, he first recorded it in a relatively tame form that year, and the single went absolutely nowhere. The song's dark magic had yet to be awakened. All of that changed in 1956. Columbia Records, seeing that Hawkins had untapped potential, asked him to re-record I Put a Spell on You, but this time with something different to make it stand out. According to Hawkins, the plan hatched by Columbia executive Arnold Maxson was simple. Get the band drunk and see what chaos ensues. In the studio, Maxson supplied cases of cheap muscatel wine and encouraged Jay and his musicians to imbibe liberally before rolling tape. Screamin Jay, never exactly shy around booze, indulged with oomph. What followed has become rock and roll legend. Hawkins howled, growled, grunted and hollered through take after take of the song, unleashing every inhibition. The band pounded the piano and blew their horns like men possessed. The resulting recording was insane, a banshee-like explosion of emotions, a half blues lament, half diabolical incantation. When Hawkins regained sobriety and heard the playback, he was stunned. I heard all those drunken screams and groans and yells. I thought, oh my God, he later remembered of that session. In truth, Hawkins was so plastered during the recording that he blacked out. He had no memory of actually singing I Put a Spell on Ya in its now famous form, but that unhinged performance, primal and spooky and utterly unique, changed his career overnight. When I Put a Spell on Ya hit the airwaves in 1956, it was like nothing anyone had heard. Hawkins' guttural shouts and maniacal laughter on the track gave listeners chills. DJ Alan Freed dug it deeply and began spinning it on his popular radio show. And teenagers, especially white teens, who were new to this kind of wild rhythm and blues, couldn't get enough. The song became a cult hit, selling over 1 million copies, despite or more likely because of its bizarre style. It even cracked the lower rungs of the pop charts, which was still a rare feat for a black artist in that era with such an out-there sound. But mainstream success came hand in hand with controversy. To the buttoned-up Eisenhower-era public, "I Put a Spell on You" sounded positively scandalous. Murmurs spread that the song was an ode to the occult or to depravity. Some listeners were sure they heard references to cannibalism or sexual assault in Hawkins' lustful growling delivery. Many radio stations reacted by banning the record, deeming it too suggestive and wild for polite airplay. This only added to the song's allure among rebellious youth. Hawkins, for his part, leaned eagerly into the notoriety. He concocted multiple origin stories for "I Put a Spell on You" to titillate journalists. Sometimes he claimed he wrote it in a fit of anguished inspiration, after coming home to find his girlfriend had left him, letting out one long scream that birthed the song on the spot. Other times he cheerfully told the truth, that a bottle of booze or two and a crazed studio jam had done the trick. Either way, he now had a hit, and a reputation as rock and roll's newly minted madman. Alan Freed wasted no time capitalizing on Hawkins' growing fame. In 1956, Freed invited Screamin Jay to join his rock and roll review tour, which was a kind of traveling showcase of rising stars. But Freed had a condition. He wanted Hawkins to make his live act as sensational as the record. The DJ had a twisted promotional mind. This is the man who once staged a mock funeral for a rock song to drum up publicity, and he envisioned Hawkins literally emerging from a coffin on stage, like some kind of demon conjured by the music. When this idea was first pitched, Hawkins actually balked. As a black man in 1950s America, the notion of climbing into a coffin alive triggered a deep cultural superstition. "Not me," he reportedly said. "No black dude gets in no coffin alive. They don't expect to get out." Despite this wisecrack, Hawkins understood that for many black people, a coffin was no joke. Yet Freed was persistent and rather crafty. He offered Hawkins a $2,000 bonus, a pretty hefty check at the time, to do the coffin stunt. Screamin Jay finally agreed. And so, one fateful night in 1956, the audience at a New York theatre witnessed a macabre spectacle for the ages. The lights dimmed, eerie music played, and on stage lay an ornate casket. As the band struck those infamous first creeping chords of "I Put a Spell on You," the coffin lid creaked open and out stepped Hawkins, clad in a flowing black cape and clutching a smoking skull on a stick. He had a bone through his nose and eyes bulging wide in a crazed stare. Women in the crowd screamed, some in delight, some in genuine fright. Hawkins bellowed and convulsed as if possessed, belting his hit song while brandishing the skull, whom he affectionately named Henry, at the audience. It was rock theatre at its most unabashed and outrageous, and nothing quite like it had ever been seen before. The reaction was instantaneous. The crowd went ape, as Hawkins later put it. Teenagers went mad for this delirious voodoo act, and they ate it up. "That's what the public wants," Hawkins remarked knowingly. "I'd better give them what they want because they're paying the freight." In that moment, Screamin Jay Hawkins effectively invented shock rock. Years before Alice Cooper or Kiss or Marilyn Manson, there was Jay, rising from a coffin in a burst of pyrotechnics, turning a blues tune into a Halloween fright show. The coffin shtick made Hawkins a national name, but it also cemented a persona that would both define and sometimes haunt him. Night after night on the tour, he perfected the grand guignol routine, crawling out of coffins, singing with rubber snakes around his neck, scattering stage props like skulls, voodoo dolls and capes. He would roll his eyes back and stick out his tongue, letting loose blood-curdling shrieks mid-song. The press dubbed him the Black Vincent Price, a horror movie villain come to life. Parents and conservative church groups were obviously mortified, and some shows were picketed by citizens claiming Hawkins' act was an offence to morality. Even the NAACP voiced concern that Hawkins' over-the-top witch doctor imagery, with its bone-nosed primitive caricature, set back the image of black performers and fed racist stereotypes. And in one of the era's more absurd twists, the National Coffin Manufacturers Association sent Hawkins an angry letter demanding he stop using coffins, complaining that his act was desecrating the sacred image of their product. Which I have to say is bloody hilarious. Imagine being accused of sullying the reputation of the coffin. I've never heard anything like it. Anyway, Screamin Jay had managed to offend undertakers, and this really was a testament to just how far outside the norm he had ventured. Behind the scenes, Hawkins himself felt increasingly conflicted about the monster he had created. The ghoulish persona brought him fame and money, but it also pigeonholed him as a novelty act. Worse, it began to take a personal toll. To deliver the crazed performance audiences expected, Hawkins started relying on copious amounts of alcohol. He believed that the only way he could summon the demonic energy of "I put a spell on you" on stage was to get roaring drunk, just as he had during the recording. "I figured I couldn't sing the song unless I was drunk," he admitted. The act also quite literally gave him chills. He later said the whole coffin routine sent shivers through him, even as he did it. Yeah, even Screamin Jay Hawkins was scared of Screamin Jay Hawkins. But he felt trapped by it. The public demanded Screamin Jay the lunatic, and so that's what he gave them night after night, often at the expense of his own health and sanity. Only much later, by the mid-1970s, would Hawkins gain enough confidence to perform his signature song sober. In the late 50s, however, he was caught in a spell of his own making. As 1956 turned to 1957, Screamin Jay Hawkins was enjoying the spoils of his shocking success. He was headlining package tours, and "I Put a Spell on You" was now infamous nationwide. In 1958, it would even be named one of Billboard's top records, despite many stations refusing to play it. Sensing a commercial opportunity, OK Records rushed Hawkins into the studio to cut an album. The result was At Home with Screamin Jay Hawkins, released in 1958, and it came complete with a kitschy cover of Jay wearing a friendly smile and a Santa Claus hat, as if inviting listeners to a holiday party. The album was a bizarre mishmash. Alongside his spooky singles, it featured Hawkins crooning absurd versions of standards like Old Man River and I Love Paris. Perhaps the label hoped to showcase a softer side of Hawkins, or appeal to a broader audience beyond the shock factor. If so, it backfired. The public had zero interest in a domesticated Screamin Jay. They wanted a crazy witch doctor, not a smiling crooner. The album flopped disastrously. Hawkins himself had included a truly cringe-worthy track called Hong Kong on it, and this was a song full of offensive faux Chinese gibberish, which only further baffled listeners and critics. Not surprisingly, Hawkins was soon dropped by OK. The industry suits who had made a quick buck off his coffin act lost faith that he could deliver another hit. What followed were a few wilderness years for Hawkins' career, but they were anything but quiet in his personal life. Freed from major label oversight, Jay recorded a string of delightfully weird and raunchy songs for small labels. Titles like Armpit Number 6 and Constipation Blues say everything about where his artistic compass pointed during this period. These novelty records maintained his cult following and would later become underground classics, but none came close to replicating the mainstream impact of Spell. Hawkins had become, in industry terms, a one-hit wonder, and the frustration of that status gnawed at him. It didn't help that Hawkins was still entangled in self-destructive habits. The heavy drinking that he used as performance fuel often spilled into offstage life. He was earning decent money during the late 50s touring circuit, but financial security eluded him. He would spend lavishly or get entangled in bad business deals that left him broke. Moreover, Hawkins' love life was a powder keg. Women were drawn to the charismatic wild man like moths to a flame, and Jay had absolutely no inclination to be faithful or stable with any of them. By the end of the 50s, he had been married at least twice, depending on when one counts the beginning and end of each union, and had numerous mistresses on the side. Bigamy became something of a Hawkins specialty, and he often failed to formally divorce one wife before impulsively marrying the next. His first wife, Anna May, had technically never been divorced. even as Hawkins went through a parade of subsequent I do's. This cavalier approach to marriage would later come back to haunt him legally and financially. Then, in 1958, Hawkins' chaotic behaviour crossed a serious line. In that year, he was arrested and jailed on some grave charges: statutory rape and the related offence of transporting a minor across state lines. The story behind the charges was sordid. Hawkins had taken up with a girl said to be 15 years old, and on top of that, he was caught with illegal drugs, reportedly some marijuana, during the incident. The consequences were swift and harsh. Screamin Jay Hawkins, the outrageous performer who seemed larger than life, found himself wearing prison stripes. He spent a stint in prison in 1959 as punishment for his misconduct with the underage girl and the drug possession. The scandal was largely kept out of the newspapers, most likely due to Hawkins' fading prominence by that point. But it effectively derailed what momentum his career had left. By the time he emerged from jail, rock and roll had moved on without him. Chastened but not defeated, Hawkins looked for a fresh start far away from the scene of his implosion. He found it literally in the farthest state possible: Hawaii. In the early 1960s, Screamin Jay moved to Honolulu, trying to restart his performing career in the nightclubs of paradise. For nearly a decade, from 1962 to 1971, he used Honolulu as a base, playing regular lounge gigs and attempting to reinvent himself slightly. He even dabbled in starting his own music publishing business during this period. The Hawaiian exile allowed Hawkins to hide from the mainland spotlight and, perhaps, from his own bad reputation. He also spent time in New York City, now and then during the 60s, booking sporadic club dates, but it was mostly low-profile work, sustained by the modest royalties from cover versions of his songs and his ever-weird creativity in churning out new material. Of course, even in semi-seclusion, drama did not leave Jay Hawkins' life. In Hawaii, he began an open relationship with a formidable female singer named Shoutin' Pat Newborn. Shoutin' Pat was every bit as mad as Jay, and the two made a striking couple on stage and off. However, open relationships have, funnily enough, a way of breeding jealousy, and this one was no exception. Hawkins, true to form, couldn't resist secretly marrying another woman on the side at one point, without ending his arrangement with Pat, and indeed without even ending his previous marriages. When Pat Newborn discovered that Hawkins had committed this betrayal behind her back, she went bananas. One night, in a confrontation fueled by anger and likely no small amount of alcohol, Shoutin' Pat attacked Hawkins in a violent rage. Accounts vary on whether she stabbed him with a knife or actually shot him with a gun, and Hawkins himself later tended to embellish the tale depending on who was asking. But either way, Jay Hawkins ended up bleeding heavily and lucky to be alive. To add an extra twist, Pat's fury was partly over Hawkins making a solo move on one of her own girlfriends, who they sometimes shared in bed. Evidently, nothing was sacred, according to Hawkins' libertine appetites. The entire episode reads like Pulp Fiction, but it was just another day in the life of Screamin Jay. He recovered from his wounds, and perhaps wisely, parted ways with the volatile Ms. Newborn after that near-fatal fiasco. By the mid-1960s, Jay Hawkins might have seemed destined to fade into obscurity, a one-hit wonder turned nightclub oddity, licking his wounds in a lovely tropical backwater. But fate and his own enduring talent had other plans. In 1965, Hawkins got an unexpected career boost from two very different corners, one in America and one here in England. In the US, legendary singer Nina Simone recorded a sultry, smouldering cover of I Put a Spell on You. Simone's version, driven by her intense vocal delivery and a dramatic arrangement, became a hit, reaching the top 30 on the US charts. Suddenly, Hawkins' signature song was back in the spotlight, albeit through someone else's voice, and earning him renewed songwriting royalties. He could hardly complain. Simone's interpretation was widely acclaimed, and it introduced a new generation of listeners to Screamin Jay's work. At the same time, across the Atlantic, a full-fledged Screamin Jay Hawkins fan club of sorts had developed within the British R&B scene. In mod UK dance clubs, like Manchester's famous Twisted Wheel, young aficionados of American soul and blues had latched onto Hawkins' old records as exotic treasures. They spun "I Put a Spell on You" and other tracks in speed-fueled all-night dances, revering the raw energy he brought. One British performer, the utterly marvellous Screaming Lord Sutch, had even built his entire act as an homage parody of Hawkins, complete with rising out of a coffin and brandishing skulls on stage. Lord Sutch's theatrical stage antics and his later foray into politics as the leader of the joke monster-raving loony party were directly inspired by Hawkins' blueprint, proving that Jay's influence had seeped into rock culture even while he was personally out of the limelight. And don't worry, I'll be getting to an episode on Screaming Lord Sutch in the near future. It'll be a good one. When word filtered back to these British fans that the real Screamin Jay Hawkins was alive, well and performing in Hawaii, they were determined to bring him over. In 1966, promoter Don Arden, later famous as the manager of rock acts like Small Faces and father-in-law of Ozzy Osbourne, arranged a UK tour for Hawkins. Jay flew to England and found himself astonished by the devotion of the crowds of mods and rockers who packed venues to see the legendary wild man in person. The English were absolutely bonkers for Screamin Jay. The tour wasn't a huge moneymaker. Hawkins was still more a cult figure than a mainstream draw, but it revitalised his spirit. For the first time in nearly a decade, he felt wanted and even respected for his contributions to music. British musicians treated him as a kind of living legend of blues and early rock. During this period, he recorded a new album in London, his first full album since the ill-fated 1958 debut, and appeared on British television, hamming it up with the best of them. And crucially, a string of British bands began releasing covers of "I Put a Spell on You" between 1966 and 1969. The Animals, Them, fronted by Van Morrison, and Manfred Mann made it practically de rigueur to cover the song in that period. Then, Creedence Clearwater Revival put their spin on Hawkins' classic too. The CCR version in 1968 became particularly famous, a psychedelic swamp rock take that stormed the US charts and has since become one of the best-known renditions of the song. Each new cover brought Hawkins both a bit of royalty income and a measure of vindication. His music had outlasted the novelty tag and become part of the rock canon. And it's also worth mentioning that none of these fine covers quite match the magic of the original. Still, despite this mid-60s renaissance, Screamin Jay remains something of a lone wolf, drifting at the margins of the music industry. He spent the late 1960s and 70s performing sporadically, 1 month headlining a small blues club in Paris or Los Angeles, the next back in Honolulu or New York trying to drum up work. He cut odd records for independent labels, always embracing the absurd. For example, a 1969 track literally entitled "Feast of the Mau Mau" that combined primal screams with exotica-tinged jungle noises. Behind the scenes, Hawkins nursed a growing resentment. He saw imitators and younger artists reaping rewards from the kind of theatrical rock he'd pioneered, while he struggled to stay afloat. "I got fed up. I figured the world wasn't ready for me," he said, explaining his retreat to Hawaii. "In the meantime, all these people are recording my goddamn stuff. Everybody's going places with what I was doing 15 years ago. Everybody but me." The bitterness seeped out in his interviews, and not without reason. He truly was ahead of his time. Shock rock would become a big business by the 70s, but Hawkins never fully cashed in on the trail he blazed. Hawkins also complained, quite rightly, that he had been cheated financially. He never received proper royalties for "I Put a Spell on Ya" and his other early recordings. At one point, he confronted someone, variously identified as a record executive or business associate, about the missing money, only to be told bluntly, "Black people don't get royalty money. They just take what's given to them without asking." It was a stinging reminder of the racism embedded in the mid-century music business, where black artists were routinely exploited. Hawkins felt that asking too many questions had even put him in danger. He became convinced that the Italian-American mafia, which really did have significant influence in the record industry then, was out to kill him if he didn't shut up and disappear. Whether this was a paranoid delusion or had some basis in threats he actually received It's hard to say. Hawkins was, of course, rather prone to exaggeration. But he took it seriously enough that he did indeed disappear for a while in the early 70s. He largely exited the US scene, spending significant time performing in Canada and Europe, where he felt safer and more appreciated. In 1977, Hawkins got a brief taste of wider exposure again when he was invited to perform his old hit in the film American Hot Wax, a nostalgia-driven biopic about Alan Freed. Playing himself in the movie, he leapt out of a coffin and belted "I Put a Spell on You" on the big screen, reminding audiences of rock's wilder roots. It was a campy, thrilling cameo, but it didn't immediately reignite his career. By the early 1980s, Hawkins was drifting again, almost completely out of the public eye, living hand to mouth. He had at one point settled in the Northeast, renting a small apartment in New Jersey. Accounts from friends suggest he was living in near squalor, just one tiny room, sometimes without electricity or heat, full of memories and little else. Even this didn't last, and he soon found himself living in a trailer park. He was drinking heavily and also abusing pills. He developed a taste for codeine syrup, a habit that dulled his pain but also dulled his productivity. Musicians who owed him inspiration had become superstars, while Hawkins sometimes couldn't even scrape together money for a phone line. And it was in this state that a young and brilliant filmmaker found him. Jim Jarmusch was an unlikely saviour, perhaps, but exactly the one Hawkins needed. Jarmusch had a deep love of offbeat music. A lifelong fan of Screamin Jay, he had grown up enthralled by "I Put a Spell on You." The first time I ever heard it, it haunted me, Jarmusch recalled. In 1984, Jarmusch made a low-budget art house film called Stranger Than Paradise. He made Hawkins' old recording a thematic centerpiece of the movie. The song plays repeatedly as a sort of soulful leitmotif. When the film became an unexpected hit on the indie circuit, Jarmusch was dismayed to learn that Hawkins hadn't seen a dime from the use of his song. The rights were likely held by a publisher or former label that had long since cut Jay out. Determined to do right by an artist he admired, Jarmusch set out to find Hawkins. The director finally tracked the singer down in 1985. The image of their meeting sounds like a scene from a movie itself. Jarmusch arriving at a ramshackle trailer park in New Jersey, where the infamous Screamin Jay Hawkins was living in a trailer with no telephone. Hawkins, now in his mid-50s, had been so disconnected from the industry that he didn't even have a way for people to call him for gigs. Jarmusch offered not just financial compensation for the song's use, but an outstretched hand to pull Hawkins back into the spotlight. In 1989, Jarmusch cast Hawkins in his next film, Mystery Train, a cool-as-anything anthology film set in Memphis, and one of my favourite movies of all time. If you love music and haven't seen it, make it the very next thing you do. I promise you won't be disappointed. Hawkins played an eccentric night clerk, dressed in a bright red bellhop uniform. It wasn't a large role, but he brought a magnetic, off-kilter charm to every moment he was on screen. That performance earned Hawkins an Independent Spirit Award nomination for Best Supporting Male, and suddenly a new generation of artsy filmgoers knew his face, if not his whole story. Hawkins took this uplift from Jarmusch and staged a genuine comeback in the late 80s and early 90s. He began touring internationally again, this time to audiences who treated him not as a novelty, but as a legend. In Europe especially, he was revered. Filmmakers, journalists and rock musicians all wanted a piece of Screamin Jay. He opened shows for the Rolling Stones at Madison Square Garden in the early 80s. Yes, Mick Jagger and company had grown up on Hawkins' records and gave him a well-deserved slot on a massive stage. He recorded new albums, one in 1991 amusingly called Black Music for White People, even featured him covering contemporary songs like Tom Waits' Heart Attack and Vine, with his trademark growls intact. On that album, guitar hero Bo Diddley guested, and rumour has it Keith Richards jammed with Hawkins on some sessions too. If ever there were a match made in rock and roll heaven, it was the Stones and Screamin Jay. Another odd curio from this period was the 1993 album, Stone Crazy, and in particular the song titled Sherilyn Fenn. Sherilyn by that time had become internationally famous for playing Audrey Horne in David Lynch's Twin Peaks. However, prior to this, she had starred in a film called Two Moon Junction, which featured her in some rather titillating scenes. Sherilyn's performance cast a very powerful spell on her co-star, Screamin Jay, who had a small role playing another version of himself. His song about her on Stone Crazy a few years later details the exact erotic effect she still had on him. I'll leave you to check it out for yourselves to see what I mean. Very saucy stuff, as you might imagine. Hawkins also became a staple of late-night talk shows and documentaries, where his outsized personality shone. He'd show up to interviews wearing leopard print suits and carrying Henry the Skull, regaling hosts with outrageous anecdotes about his life. Most of them were utter fantasy, but who cares? They were brilliant stories. Fans couldn't get enough. By the 1990s, Hawkins had firmly re-established himself as an elder statesman of shock and awe. Tired of America's chaotic music business and craving a place where he felt genuinely appreciated, he moved permanently to France. Paris had long offered refuge to black American musicians, from Josephine Baker to jazz greats like Dexter Gordon, and Hawkins found the environment to his liking. He married for the sixth and final time to a French woman named Monique, who was over 40 years his junior, a fact Hawkins naturally wore as a badge of honor. Settling in Paris, he became a popular live attraction at clubs and music festivals. Parisian night spots like the Maxwell Café hosted Screamin Jay performances 3 or 4 times a month. Hip Parisians loved his blend of American blues tradition and theatrical flair. Even in his late 60s, Hawkins did not tone it down. He still took the stage in full macabre regalia, complete with the cape, the voodoo stick, and Henry, of course. Those who saw Hawkins in his final years often remarked on how healthy and vibrant he appeared. He stayed lean and fit, aside from a persistent smoking habit, and could still bellow a note with spine-tingling power. In fact, at age 70, Hawkins looked a good 20 years younger. After decades of wrestling with the gimmick of Screamin Jay, he had made peace with it. "I wish I could be who I was before I was me," he once lamented during darker times, reflecting on how his crazy stage persona overshadowed the real Jealousy Hawkins. But by 1999, he saw things differently. "I find I can make people react more quickly if I walk on with a skull and snakes," he told a reporter, describing the joy he still found in shocking an audience. "I see smiles on their faces and they're clapping and saying, 'Here comes the crazy man,' and I know it's gonna be all right." In other words, he had embraced his legacy as rock and roll's lovable boogeyman. The crowds were smiling with him now, not recoiling in fear. Screamin Jay Hawkins' story came to an end not with an onstage mishap or some barroom brawl, though many who knew him might have predicted such an exit, but quietly, in a hospital. In February 2000, Hawkins was on tour in France when he suddenly fell gravely ill. He had an emergency surgery for an aneurysm at a hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine. The surgery, unfortunately, led to complications. On February 12, 2000, Hawkins died of internal bleeding and organ failure at age 70. It was a shocking blow to those who had seen him only days or weeks earlier, apparently full of life and vigor. His wife Monique was by his side when he passed. The man who used to jest that he'd, quote, "go out of this world black, naked and ugly," had finally taken his last bow in a well-appointed hospital in an upscale part of Paris, nonetheless leaving behind a tangled web of stories, scandals and songs. True to the spirit of Screamin Jay, even his death was accompanied by a swirl of rumours and drama. One of his ex-wives, his fifth Virginia, whom he had married in the 1970s and stayed with for 16 turbulent years, hinted darkly that Jay might have been murdered. Most shocking of all was her claim that he'd told friends his young sixth wife Monique was poisoning him slowly and suggesting that his sudden decline was no coincidence after all. These allegations were never proven nor investigated by authorities. Most who knew the couple dismissed them as unfounded gossip or perhaps the bitterness of a spurned spouse. In the world of Screamin Jay Hawkins, however, a little mystery was par for the course. Whether or not any foul play occurred, the very fact that people whispered about it seemed a fittingly macabre epilogue for the coffin-rocking showman. What was absolutely real in the aftermath of Hawkins' passing was the incredible scope of his personal legacy, not in terms of wealth or awards, but in flesh and blood. As the new millennium dawned, a curious project began unfolding online. One of Hawkins' longtime friends and sometime biographers, Maral Nigolian, set up a website with a singular goal: to track down and identify all of Screamin Jay Hawkins' children. It had been a running joke, or was it a boast, of Jay's in life that he had fathered dozens upon dozens of kids. Depending on which day you asked him, he'd throw out numbers like 57 or even 75 children, scattered across various cities and continents. Given Hawkins' voracious appetite for women and the nomadic nature of his career, it wasn't entirely implausible, but it was astonishing nonetheless. Most people, including some of Hawkins' bandmates, assumed it was just another exaggerated Hawkins yarn. Nigolian suspected otherwise. She knew the man and his habits too well. "I'll put a spell on you" might have been his anthem, but "I'll put a baby in you" could well have been another refrain, considering his remarkable fertility. The jayskids.com website, as it came to be known, invited anyone who suspected they might be Hawkins' offspring to come forward. Soon, emails and calls poured in from individuals who had heard family whispers or possessed old photos of their mother with a tall, bone-nosed bluesman. DNA tests were arranged, and one by one, the count of confirmed progeny climbed. The numbers were staggering, not 3 or 5 or 10, but dozens of children turned out to be biologically linked to Jealousy Hawkins. By the time Nigolian's project ran its course, she had verified at least 33 of Hawkins' children around the world. 33! And those were just the ones conclusively proven. She suspected the true total might indeed be in the 50s. Here were grown men and women, many of them middle-aged by then, discovering they all shared a father, a flamboyant ghost of rock and roll past, whom some had never even heard of until the DNA results came in. In 2001, a year after Hawkins' death, several of these newly united half-siblings met up in Los Angeles for what was surely a truly unique family reunion. They even posed together for a portrait with a banner that read, "Screamin Jay Hawkins Kids." The image was oddly heartwarming, a little surreal, and a final wild chapter in the story of a man who lived purely on his own terms. He left a trail of destruction in his personal life and a small village of neglected children, but many remember him as a man of warmth and humour. For now, in a quiet Paris cemetery, Jealousy Hawkins' remains lie at rest. No more coffins to jump out of. He's finally staying put in one. But listen closely whenever the night wind blows through the trees just right, and you might hear a distant, maniacal laugh, a raspy voice singing about casting a spell on you. That's Screamin Jay, still doing his eternally grisly shtick in the great beyond. He wouldn't go quietly, and indeed, he hasn't. Screamin Jay Hawkins cast a spell on rock and roll, and it's still working. The man is gone, but the mystery and the magic are still right here. Alright, that was a roller coaster of a life. I love a bit of Screamin Jay Hawkins. Let me know which version of I Put a Spell on You like the best. Is it Nina Simone's, CCR's, the original, or another? Drop me a comment and we'll chat about it. Don't forget to subscribe and also have a look at my other channel, Society Mysteries, where I've got a new video up all about Edie Sedgwick. I've been Chester. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.